Well, I hope everyone can hear me, and good morning. Sorry, and I apologize. I'm a little bit late getting started here. Had some computer malfunctions, and anyway, I'm on now, and we're going to continue. And first off, I'd like to extend my appreciation to Jana, and the rest of the crew there at College Station for asking me to provide some information this morning on basic livestock evaluation. I'm going to go through a set of slides real quick that's going to be very basic and brief about what we're going to do this morning. And then we're going to move into some livestock evaluation through some virtual websites that I have set up. And so hopefully by the end of the day that you will learn something about the basics of evaluating livestock, all four species, and then hopefully at the end of the day, we'll have some time to answer some questions if you might have any. A little bit about me. Again, my name is Chad Coburn. I'm the county extension agent in Sterling City. I've been in extension for 24 years. I have 2 degrees from Angelo State University, Bachelor of Science in Animal Science, and then a Master of Science in Animal Science through beef cattle production also at Angelo State. I'm married, been married for 23 years to my wife, Tracy. I have a 20-year-old daughter that judged livestock at Glenn College and will begin at Texas A&M in the fall and will be on their livestock judging team. And then I have a 17-year-old son, Gunner, who show steers and was a member of the 2019 Texas 4-H champion livestock judging team. So let's get started. A little bit more about me. When I was a kid, I grew up in Fredericksburg, Texas, but I did not show animals until I was in high school, and then I started showing hogs. Had 2 good ag teachers that got me into showing and judging, and so in 1988, our meats judging team, were the state champion meat judging team, and was fortunate enough to be the high individual of that contest. Initially, I never planned on judging livestock collegiately, didn't know a whole lot about it, to be honest with you. And so when I was a freshman, I was going to go to Angelo State, do my basics, and then transfer to Texas A&M. Once I got to Angelo State, my livestock judging coach, Dave Clevenger, tried to recruit me to start judging livestock. And so I did that as a freshman. Looking back, that's may not be the smartest thing to do to judge collegiate livestock on a senior college level as a freshman, but that's what I did, and I was blessed to have finished in the top 10 at several contests, including the national contest at Louisville. Since then, after I've joined Extension, I've been blessed to have judged in most states and have judged all the Texas majors and several of the big shows across the country. Why I'm telling you all this, if you're interested in livestock judging, it's never too late to start, and it's never too late to be successful. And so I say that I reviewed the participant ages, most of y'all that are on here today, and it looks like we're in about the 12 to 16, 17 year range. And so some of you haven't decided if you want to judge livestock collegiately, and some of you have. And so that's okay. And so just know this, if you're kind of a little older and haven't really got into the livestock judging thing yet, but it's something that you want to try, never feel like that it's too late to start. So here's some things that I think that's important that we learn from evaluation, and it's not all about learning how to evaluate livestock. It's about becoming a better person and making some decision skills. And so this slide represents some things that I think are very important and that you can learn from evaluation of livestock. Here's the most important one, in my opinion. It's the first bullet. It educates people, you, to become leaders in the animal agriculture industry. And so what that means is hopefully when old people like me get out of the industry, there'll be young people that can pick up the ball and continue the animal agriculture legacy that we have here in the United States. Also, evaluation, very importantly, promotes wholesome and safe products. I'm sure you know this, but the United States definitely has the safest and the most wholesome food products in the world. Unmatched. And so we want to continue that with young folks like you that can learn to evaluate stock and make our stock better. It improves phenotype and genotype. All phenotype means that's a fancy word for what they look like. Genotype is a fancy word for genetics on how animals are bred. Obviously, livestock judging gives you an opportunity to compete. My teams compete year-round all over the country, pretty much all over the state of Texas, and then we've been blessed and fortunate to participate in some bigger contests across the U.S. And so it's always a good thing to compete. I think it's healthy to compete in a positive way, and so that's definitely one of the advantages of livestock judging. Scholarship opportunities are big. There's a lot of really good schools out there that you can go to evaluate livestock. If you're going to start out on the junior college level, like my daughter did, she was able to get a scholarship to Blinn College and pay for her school, and we'll continue that opportunity at Texas A&M with scholarships as well. So livestock judging, I compare it to sports. It is a sport, in my opinion, and so if you're not the most athletic youngster out there, just know that there's scholarships available for livestock judging to where you can get a large portion, if not all, of your education paid for through livestock judging. Most importantly, on any judging team or any sport or any competition, here's what it does for you. Livestock judging, decision-making skills are a must. I mean, you've got to make quick decisions on classes very quickly sometimes. And so it allows you and forces you to learn how to make decisions quickly and accurately. It also gives you the opportunity to improve your public speaking skills. Obviously, on the senior level, oral reasons are a large part of our contest. And so you'll learn how to talk and present yourself in a very professional way. I think that's very important. Interpersonal skills, all that means is getting along with folks and learning how to compete and be on a team. And then workforce preparedness. So obviously with good speaking skills, those kids that participate in 4-H and livestock judging specifically are very marketable once they go into a workforce scenario to where it's time to get a job. And so those things are very important. And those are a few of the things that you can learn from the evaluation of livestock. Okay, so these are the things that you got to know. And I sent, hopefully all of you got the attachment that I sent late last week with the basic anatomy of the species that we're going to be talking about. And so I'll be speaking, hopefully not over your head, but I'm going to use some terms that hopefully you know. And if you've got those handouts handy by you, then that'll help you to refer back if you don't understand what I'm talking about. And so what does the ideal animal look like? What does the industry prefer? What does the consumer prefer? What do you think's the best? And those are all things that are going to come into play on evaluation of stock. And so when we think about what the ideal steer looks like, what does that perfect one look like in your mind? And so on and so forth with swine, sheep, and goats, all the species that we're going to consider. What are our placing criteria? What are the most important things that we're going to look for? We're going to go over that throughout the morning. And so there's certain criteria that are more important in market animals versus breeding animals and so on. And so what our priorities are going to be may be a little different from one class to the next. Before we get into the judging part of it, there's a few resources that I think are very important. I've been fortunate to have coached the state champion team for the last 2 years, and I utilized both of these or all of these resources, but there's two very important ones that I think that if you're going to judge livestock, either you can get your subscription or your judging coach hopefully can get them. If you first and foremost, live animal evaluation is the best, there's no doubt. But with school schedules and the situation we're in with coronavirus, it's a good idea to go ahead and be subscribed to these online resources. The first one that I want to mention is livestockjudging.com. We will actually be looking at classes from livestockjudging.com today, and we will also be utilizing classes from judgetowin.com. And so I have the 4-H Club has subscriptions to both of those websites, and I use those very extensively. As a matter of fact, I use them probably, well, not probably, the majority of the time when I'm coaching, because by the time kiddos get out of school and it's in the fall and winter, it gets too dark too early, and so we utilize the computer programs a bunch. There's another one called the judgingconnection.com. That one provides some good classes. They're more picture-based, photo-based instead of virtual, and so take that for what it's worth. And then a lot of ag teachers still utilize the ICEV online videos. And so those are a few of the resources that are out there for you to improve your selection. Let me back up here. All right, we're going to get started with the basics before we get into the videos. And so obviously when we're analyzing livestock, whether it be cattle, swine, sheep, or goats, we're going to have market classes, and we're also going to have breeding classes. And so there's some fundamental differences between those when it comes time to make a decision and select a class winner and so on and so forth. So let's get started very basically on market animals, and we're going to get very detailed and specific throughout the morning. But obviously when we judge market animals, the first and the most important criteria is muscularity. And so just remember this if you're young, market means muscle. So that's the number one thing that we're going to look for. And this is just a general statement here, look for indicators of muscling over the top side of their skeleton and through their round and stifle for cattle, leg for sheep, and ham for swine. And so all that means, that's all the same thing with different terminology. And so obviously there's going to be different terms that I'm going to use for cattle versus sheep versus hogs and so on and so forth. Structural correctness is no doubt one of the most important things that we're going to look for in market and breeding animals. And I always coach teams to know, or hopefully to learn, if you can ever figure out skeletons and the way that bones are put together, then judging becomes much, much easier. And so structurally, the ideal market animal is one that is extended up front, he's level down his top, he's level out of his hip, but he stands square and correct on his feet. We're going to get much more detailed about that, but those are just some basics to look for in market animals. Market means muscle, backed up with a good structure. Breeding classes are very similar, but yet different. Structural correctness becomes the most important thing. And after all, breeding animals will go back into the herd or the flock, and we're going to use those to progress our genetics. And so the ideal breeding animal, again, is one that's extended, level, and stands square. Volume and capacity becomes much, much more important on breeding animals, especially females. And all that means is how big they are in terms of their center body. And so we want our females to have a lot of rib shape, a lot of depth of body, a lot of width of body. And all that goes to the fact that we want them to be able to maintain pregnancy, have a healthy baby at their gestation endpoint. And so volume and capacity in breeding animals is paramount. Femininity and masculinity, hopefully today we're going to get through all of our classes, and so we've got some female classes, and I do have a bull class, and so femininity and masculinity are important, and we'll get much more detailed about that as well. Muscle, you can see that muscularity in breeding animals is important, but at the same time it's a little bit lower down the list, and so we got to stick to our fundamentals of quality and structure before we go back and revert back to muscle. And balance and eye appeal, that's a general statement. And so that's, I like to say that balance and eye appeal is the initial impression that I have. And so when I first turn my back or turn around to a class or see an animal for the first time, I get a first impression of him, much like you get a first impression of someone you meet. So if I look at an animal for the first time and it's an animal that offers some quality and some presence, then that's what goes back to balance and eye appeal. Okay, we're fixing to start with our market cattle talk, and so let's go back and touch on the points before we get to our class. So market cattle, again, market means muscle, that's first on the list. And so we're going to look for muscularity several places on cattle. Most important places we're going to evaluate them for muscle are down their tops and from behind. And I'm going to use some cattle terminology. And so if you've got your handout, it's a heifer handout that I gave you, but it also is, it still refers to the same things that we need to look for in market cattle. So second on our list is finish, and all finish means is fat. We want cattle to be fat enough to reach what we call a quality grade of choice or high select. That's going to get pretty intense for you youngsters, and we're not going to touch on that deeply today, but all finish refers to is the proper degree of fat. I want them fat enough to reach a choice grade of choice, or quality grade of choice, excuse me, but at the same time, I want them lean enough to reach a yield grade of 1 or 2, and all that means is yield grades are determined by back fat thickness, and so I want them fat enough to grade, but yet lean enough to reach a yield grade that's appropriate. Third on our list, again, is structural correctness. I could even tell you that structural correctness to me is very, very important. And again, I'm going to talk about how bones are connected. And so we can put those pieces of the puzzle together. And once we understand how those puzzle pieces are put together, then muscle becomes an easy thing to judge. And fourth on our list is going to be how they look, our first impression, and those types of things. Okay, so back up here, I'm going to get out of this, and I'm going to not do that. Hopefully you can see my screen.
Hey, Chad, all we see right now is your PowerPoint still.
Okay, so can you see the cattle now?
Nope, still your PowerPoint presentation.
Okay, so how do I get back to share my screen?
You should be able to click down in the, or up
resume
in the,
share. Now can you see the cattle?
No.
No.
You should be able to change the screen that you're wanting to share.
New share.
There you go.
How about that?
There it is.
Okay, but you can. Everyone can still hear me, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and now it's a large screen. Yes.
Yep. You're
okay.
Good.
All right. Good deal. And so this class of market steers is taken from livestockjudging.com. And so we're going to talk about the cattle real quick as a group, and then I'm going to go ahead and play this video and talk about the cattle, and I'm going to stop the video and talk about the cattle throughout the morning as we go through these classes. Can everyone see my cursor moving around? Or can you see my cursor moving around?
Yes. Yeah, we can see
it. Great.
Yes.
Okay, so let's just start looking at these cattle as a general first impression. And again, that goes back to balance and eye appeal, but at the same time, we've got to remember what our criteria list is on what's the most important. So as we look at this number 1 steer here, this red calf, my first impression of him is that he's a little bit off quality. And what I mean by that is when I look at balance and eye appeal and the way that he's proportioned, he's not quite right in terms of his lines. And so obviously from this view, we're not going to tell a whole lot about muscularity. We can look at muscularity a little bit through the point of their shoulder, through their forearm, and the shape and expression that they have through the round. And so just by looking at this guy as an individual, my first impression of him is not the best, okay? And so as we look at this second steer, this yellow calf here, he's a nice steer. And so as we study his skeleton, his front third versus his middle third versus his rear third, again, he's a steer that maybe not the nicest balanced calf that we're going to see, but he's still a nice high quality steer. As you study his muscularity from a profile perspective, we can easily see that he's got more shape and expression than the one steer does. But at the same time, this calf, as we're going to see throughout the video here, probably could use a shot more. Now these two steers down here, hopefully you can see the difference between what I'm going to call really impressive high quality cattle with some presence, being these two steers versus these two cattle up here. And so this 3 steer, even though he's going to have some trade-offs structurally, he's still a nice calf that presents a high quality look at your first impression. And hopefully you can see that no doubt this guy's got a big forearm in him, huge expressive round in him. And so he's going to be one of the more muscular cattle in class. Same thing with this guy. He's got a big forearm and a shapely stifle or round. So I'm going to go ahead and play this. Hopefully it'll work for us. And I'm not going to talk. Well, I am going to talk. But anyway, just study these cattle. And I'm going to stop it once they get on a rear view and a top side view. And we'll learn a lot more about muscle shape right here. So as you study these cattle from behind, one thing that you want to keep in mind if you're able to get these subscriptions is video camera angle. And so that's really deceiving and real hard for especially young evaluators to understand, is to get in mind that some of these pictures and videos are taken at different angles and different distances. And so this one steer, you'll notice that his video is taken a lot closer than, say, these two steers. And so at first you're thinking, wow, that one may be one of the more muscular steers from behind, when in reality he's not. But I'm going to teach you how to know that for sure, not based on a picture or a video. And so there's indicators of muscle from this view that we can easily determine. So if we look at this calf just in terms of what we see from behind, not looking at his leg structure, not looking down his top yet, but just this box basically from his tail head on either side, we can determine a lot about muscularity. And so these little things here that you can see on either side of his tail are called pones. And that's going to correlate to fat and finish, which we're going to get to in a minute. But if you'll look at this calf here, also right below the pone or below the fat are what's called pin bones. And so obviously the wider the pin set, the more muscle shape this guy's going to have up on the top side of his round. And so looking at red here, number 1, there's his pins. And so we want to basically measure muscle in our minds. And so we're going to measure the widest part of his round, which I like to refer to as his stifle or his quarter, which would be right here. And so this steer, just as an individual, is one that I would deem average in terms of muscularity. Through the upper part of his hip, through the center part of his quarter, and the lower 1/3 of his quarter is where this guy really needs to be changed and improved. You can especially see it right here. He definitely wants to taper in down at the lower 1/3 of his quarter. So this guy needs more muscle shape. You'll notice that number 2, the video of him was taken quite a bit further away. And so I can tell you, just by knowing the cattle and being there at that contest, this one was considerably more muscular. So there's his pin bones. He doesn't have near as much pone as this red steer does, but he's okay, is what I'll say. He's more than average in terms of shape, the center part of his stifle. He's no doubt more muscular than one through the lower part of his quarter. Now, how about this guy? So pretty easy to see that these two white steers have more muscularity than either 1 or 2. So if you look at this 3's calf here, there's a pin bone, there's a pin bone. That is extremely big upper hip, extremely muscular and shapely through the center part of the stifle, and extremely good through the lower 1/3 of his quarter. So we can easily determine that this steer from behind is one of the more muscular cattle in class. This steer here, same deal. If you look on either side, there's a pin bone, there's a pin bone. There's the center part of his quarter. There's the lower part of his quarter. these two steers, even though similar, are the two muscular cattle in class. So let's forward a little bit on the video. Okay, these pictures aren't very good, or this video is not great on showing topside shape. But that, obviously, if everyone's eaten beef before, and so if you've ever eaten a T-bone, a ribeye, a tenderloin, a sirloin, all those cuts of meats come from the top side of their skeleton. And so it's very easy, once you understand where to look, to determine muscle shape in any species. And so it's if you're young and small, it's kind of somewhat difficult for you sometimes to get on top of the cattle and look down their tops. But at the same time, if you can get on top of them, and all I mean by that is maybe standing on your tippy toes where you can see down their tops. But if you will consider an imaginary line down their tops, and so you can see it in all of these cattle because of their color. If you look at this red steer, he's basically got a dark colored line going all the way down his spine. And so on and so forth for all of these steers. And so if they're colored to where you can see that, that helps you. Because basically I want my students or 4-H members to be able to measure in your mind the distance between that line and his loin edge. And so if we start right here at the top of this red one's shoulder, and we go back here to about his 12th and 13th rib, which will be where the cursor is, I want to visually measure how wide it is from his spine over to the edge, okay? And then I want to come back here to his hook bone, which will be about right here. And then I want to measure how thick and how wide he is from his spine to the edge of his loin, okay? So if we're looking at this red steer here, you can see that he is not the most muscular steer in here. And so if we study that line, look over the edge there, okay, versus here, and then from his hook bone to his tail head, or basically from his hooks to his pins, I want a full, thick rump. You can see how this steer right here at his hooks wants to get narrower out of his pins. That tells me he's not very thick. This 2 steer here, imaginary line going down his spine, definitely has more shape here than does 1. Definitely has more shape over his edges. Definitely bigger and fuller out of his hip. Okay, this 3 steer, we remember from our rear view how thick he was from behind. Right here, from that backbone over his 12th and 13th, he's a little deceiving. And all I mean by that is that steer, as massive as he is from behind, he could use a shot more muscularity right here. Now that's not true here. As we measure from his spine over his loin edge, he's very big and shapely right there, so we like that about him. And again, from hooks to pins, that steer's really wide and massive, so we like that about him. The 4 steer, he's got the most shape and turn to his top. So if we look at this guy right here, and we measure him from there to there, just like we did the rest, his picture shot's a little further away, but that guy's got a real shapely top to him, and we like that about him. He's real shapely right here over his loin edge. And again, much like 3, from his hooks to his pins, there's a hook, there's a pin, gets really wide and massive. So from our top side shape view and from our rear view, we can determine very quickly that cattle 3 and 4 are more muscular than cattle 2 and 1, okay? Now let's talk about fat cover real quick, or finish. We can look at finish visually in several different areas in cattle. And so a lot of contests will not allow you to look at or to handle cattle. And if you were able to handle them, you would handle them over their 12th and 13th rib, which is basically right about here. And we want cattle to handle with a firm, fresh, smooth touch. But I'm going to talk more about finish in regards to visual on how you can tell by looking if they've got enough fat or if they're too fat. So there's indicators of fat cover and finish visually. Right here is called their brisket. And so we want that brisket to be full. And so looking at these cattle here, and I don't want you to get fullness or brisket confused with structure issues. And so this steer, we already said he had some pones. I'm going to talk more about pones in a minute, but he's really full in his brisket. So I can tell right there in his brisket that he's got some fat. Another indicator through the rear, or excuse me, from the side view is in his flank. A full flank refers to fat. And there again, you can see his pones. So he's got a fat cover, or he's got some fat covering his brisket. He's got some fat covering his flank. He's got some pones. And so we'll talk about more about where we can see fat from a rear view, but this guy's got enough on him. This guy, he's full in his brisket. He's a little more cut up in his flank, so he's not as fat as one. And he's got a little bit of pone presentation there, not much. Okay, this steer is what I'm going to refer to as a high cutability one. And what that means is that he's relatively lean, but yet at the same time he's muscular. So he's really clean through his brisket. He's still deep and full through his flank. And so he's going to be, that refers to balance. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But this calf doesn't have much of a pone, and so he's not tremendously fat. This steer here, kind of hard to see his brisket, but he's got some fullness in his brisket. He's okay in his flank, and he's average in what I'd call in terms of finish over his pones. Now let's look at him from behind real quick. Okay, if you look at pones again, those are indicators of fat. And in these cattle, another one that's important is cod fat. And it's hard to see them here, but once they get castrated, after the removal of the testicles, they will fill up with fat there. And so it depends on how they're castrated and so on and so forth. So I don't want you necessarily to rely on that, but you can look at cod fat to determine fat thickness as well. Again, these pones, all that is fat that's deposited around their tail head. So one's got a lot of fat. This two steer a little, not much here on 3, and not much here on 4. And so in terms of finish, we can say comfortably that one's the fattest in class. And I don't think he's too fat to be a placing criteria, but I can tell you that in terms of quality grade, this guy's going to be better in terms of quality grade because he's got more fat on him. Now, with that said, don't get confused. He's the lightest muscled, remember? So cutability is not in his favor. Cutability refers, again, to lean and muscularity. So he's the lightest muscled, so cutability does not work in his advantage. This steer 3 and this steer 4 are the high cutability cattle. So if you look at 3, he's got, again, muscle, and he's got some fat cover on him. So appropriate degree of finish is in the favor of cattle 3 and 4, again, and 2 is acceptable as well, with 1 being the fattest. All right, let me play the video real quick here. Let's talk about skeletal structure. That's going to be next on our list in terms of market cattle. We, again, as I talked about the slides a while ago where we referred to what's the most important, let's look at skeletons in detail. And so we've got a calf here in this one steer that's ill-balanced. In other words, his structure is not perfect. So I want you to be able to analyze livestock in thirds. I want to be able to analyze the front third as it relates to his middle third, as it relates to his rear third. If we look at this one steer, we want a long extended neck, and that calf does have that. At the same time, we want them to be smooth at the point of their shoulder. That calf's acceptable. We want them to be level down their tops. He's acceptable. We want them to be level from their hooks to their pins. That's the hook bone, that's the pin bone. That is a structure problem in this steer. And so if you'll notice, from his hooks to his pins, he's too steep out of his hip. And as you look at the lower 1/3 of his skeleton, this guy's really got some issues. And so he wants to get deep in his chest, okay? And if he was proportional, and what I mean by that, if we can draw a straight line from his foreflank to his rear flank, then that's okay. That's not the case with this guy. And so he wants to get pinched in his forerib, which causes this little dip here. And then, more importantly, as you study him from his sheath back, he really wants to get up in his flank. Okay? So that's a balance issue for him. So structurally, he's going to have some problems. This 2 steer, another calf that's got some extension out through his neck, even though he's a little crestier, and all that means is that, follow that line there, he wants to get up in his neck just a little. It's called crest. He's okay in terms of the smoothness that he has to his shoulder, because he's got so much more muscle. He's going to be a little bolder shoulder. Here, the balance issue through his lower 1/3 becomes a concern for me. I like him from here to here, but he wants to cut up in his rear flank just a little bit. He's level enough down his top, even though he's a little weak. Here, he wants to be a little off in his hip. There's his hook. There's his pin. And so from a balance and look perspective, not the best, but definitely not as bad as this red one here. So let's look at these 2 cattle. So this one here, structurally, from his shoulder blade back, is very impressive. And so if you look at the levelness that he has down his top, the levelness that he has out of his hip, the proportionality that he has through his lower 1/3, that steer is very impressive. Now, structurally, he's got some concerns up front through his front 1/3. This calf wants to get a little cresty about his neck. But more importantly, as you study the angle to his joints, right here in his forearm, he wants to get upright. And what I mean by that is he's too straight here. That causes him to get over at his knee just a little bit. And you can see that right there where the cursor is. Now, is he acceptable structurally in what we consider sound? Absolutely. But that's where we'd modify and change him. Look at this steer. Really impressive from the side. Really extended out through his neck. Extremely long and level down his top. He's really level out of his hip. He's good in terms of his angles out through his knee, from his knee to the ground. And yet at the same time, he's got some proportionality through the lower 1/3 of his skeleton, even though he cuts up just a little bit. Let's look at him in motion. If you're allowed to see livestock move, you're going to be way, way ahead of the game, because if you can study the way that their feet match the surface, that's going to help tremendously when you're judging. Let's see if we can get this. Okay, real quick, let's go back to finish real quick. If you look at these cattle up front, there's a good view of their brisket. Fat cattle are real full in their brisket. And so you remember this steer had the pones and the depth of flank, and there's the fullness that he has in his brisket. This steer doesn't deposit as much fat as the other cattle, but this steer and this steer are both very appropriate in terms of degree of finish. So let's go back and see if we can see some structure issues here. Okay, watch these cattle walk. And what I want you to look at real quickly, and we got to move ahead because I'm spending too much time on the steers. I want that front foot track to match that rear foot track. And so as these cattle move, you're going to notice some differences between them. If you look at this one steer, there's a step he's taking. In other words, he's already lifted up his front foot. There's his rear foot. And so there's a gap there in between his front and his rear foot. And so that tells me structurally he's got some issues. He's restricted in his mobility. And look at this hip, folks. Remember we said that he's steep hip? That's a bad hip, okay? if you look at this 2-steer move, okay, he's picking up that front foot and that hind foot. There's not as much of a gap there. I'm not going to say he's the soundest one in there, but he's still good enough at the ground, definitely better than this red steer. Okay, this is a good place to stop and look at this 4-steer. Super good at the ground in terms of the soundness. Here's a step. It's almost, those toes are almost touching each other when he goes away. So that one's what we call covers his tracks, and that's very, very advantageous. And so he's the most structurally correct steer in the class on the go. Let's see if we can see this white one over here move. Okay, so when he takes a step, he's hate to say, the second soundest. That maybe not the best grammar, but he is second in terms of soundness in the class because his track covers itself, but at the same time, remember from profile, he wanted to get a little straight fronted, okay? So we're almost done with this class. Let's go back to the basics here. We talked about number 1, muscularity, number 2, finish, number 3, structure, and number 4, the balance, the eye appeal, the first impression. So from our example here, we determine immediately that we have 2 steers here in 3 and 4 that have the muscularity and the finish that we like. We also determined that 3 and 4 are the more structurally correct cattle in class that have the balance and the look that we're looking for. So if we had to place this class, we can easily determine that these 2 steers need to be in the top pair, followed by these 2 cattle. So between 3 and 4, I want a calf that, or a steer or an animal that's the most complete. The one that combines muscle, finish, structure, and that balance factor that we're talking about is 4. So 4 beats 3 barely. And why is it so close? Because 3 is the other high quality steering class, super massive from behind. He's more expressive through his round, but if you know what the most important the most important cuts of meat that bring the most money, they come from the top side. And so remember that this steer is better here than he was, and so it's a close decision. Now, if you get in the bottom pair, it's not close in my opinion. I think this yellow steer easily beats the red one. He's got more muscle shape down his top. He's got more muscle shape from behind. He's good in terms of his finish because he's got enough on him, but yet he's lean and he's sound enough at the ground. This is the calf that's the lightest muscled. He's got more fat trim. He's the most structurally incorrect, and he's the most restricted on the go. Couple that with the fact that he's the least attractive. So to finish up the market steers, we're going to have to move along pretty quickly here. I would have placed this class 4, 3, 2, 1, and it would have been a relatively close decision on top, a very big, what we call cut, an easy decision in the middle, and another really substantial cut in the bottom. So 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's move on. We've got to get faster, or I do. Can everyone see that, or can whoever my moderators are? I hope you can.
Yeah, we can.
Yes, we can see that.
Okay. All right, let's talk about market hogs real quick. I'm not going to refer back to the slide set because of time, but again, for you young ones that just starting out, this is a market class. So market means muscle. So in hogs, muscularity is easy to see. And that's the first and the most important criteria that we're going to look for. We're going to look for muscle shape exactly like we did in cattle. We're going to look for muscle down their tops and from behind. We're going to make that imaginary line down their tops, and we're going to visually measure how thick they are down their tops. Now, here's the key to swine judging. If you don't hear me say anything about swine judging today, listen to this. Judge hogs at the ground. And what that means is hogs that are wide based. In other words, they're coming when they're walking towards you and they're wide chested, and they're walking away from you and they're wide from behind, they do have muscle. Okay? And so in this class, there's going to be some huge differences between these hogs. And so we're going to figure out pretty quick that there's two wide-based hogs that have muscle. There's one that's really narrow, and then there's one that kind of fits in between. And so muscles first, and then skeletal width. I just talked about that. We want hogs to be wide at the ground. And so if they're wide chested and they're wide going away, they're going to have enough muscle shape. And this all goes back to structural correctness and skeletons. And so that's next on our list. So just think of it this way. If they're wide chested, then are they going to have enough forerib shape and rib cage? The answer is yes. If they're wide base from behind, are they going to be big enough out of their hip or wide enough out of their pins? The answer is yes. Okay? So if they're wide chested and wide going away, they should have muscle, they should have rib. Okay? So in terms of structure, we want hogs that are elevated up through their chest. And so if you look at this hog right here, we'll play the video in a minute, but he's really elevated up front. You can see that he's got some chest floor width. And at the same time, we want them to be level down their tops. We want them to be level out of their hip and high in their tail set. That's a little different deal than the cattle because we want these tails to sit high on their spine, okay? And so I'm gonna start this. Okay, so on the side view here, again, this is a decent look at this hog. Extended up front, level topped, level hipped, high tail set, okay? And if you study this hog through the lower 1/3 of his skeleton, he's proportional from his foreflank to his rear flank. Now, soundness and functionality is very, very important in livestock judging, especially on hogs. And all that means is the angles that we have to their joints need to be flexible and comfortable. So you'll notice that this hog here, you can see that it's a toenail actually. We call that a dew claw, and there's his actual toe. He's got flex right there, and that bone's called a pastern. And so when he walks, he takes a flexible, comfortable step, and you can see that from behind as well on him. And then some of the others, well, you can't see it really well. Some of the others get a little tighter, and we'll see that when they start moving. So remember, again, on the basics, muscularity, functionality, and then we go back again to that overall first impression and balance and look. And I like to say it like this. Does this part of his body match this part? And does that part match that part? And does both of those parts match that part? That's confusing. But I want all the thirds to match. Okay? Let's look at these hogs move. Okay, look at this hog. Let's just focus on this guy first. This number 1 hog. In terms of balance, I wish I could kind of interact with you. I would ask you the question, is he balanced? The answer is no. And so when he goes away and walks away from us, this guy wants to tie his neck in low. In other words, I'd rather have his neck project out higher at his shoulder. He wants to get up in his top. He wants to get off or steep in his hip, okay? Watch him move. Just focus on number 1. Okay? You can see it real well right there. That neck should come out more like this than it does down low, okay? Now focus only on number 2. That is a nice, balanced, easy moving, good hog, okay? So when that guy goes away from us, he's extended, he's correct, he's level, he's good enough out of his hip and his tail set, and watch him cover his track. Now, hogs aren't going to be as, their tracks aren't going to make quite like a calf, okay? And so in terms of soundness, that's a good sound functional hind leg. Now focus on 3. How about him? He's got some balance, doesn't he? He's the one that's the most extended out through his jowl and his neck. There's his jowl. He's level enough down his top. He's not perfect out of his hip, okay? And he's not as massive in terms of his center body as this 2 hog is, but he's still a good hog. Still sound. Okay, let's watch this calico color number 4. Okay, so he strikes me, the first impression that I have of him is off quality. In other words, he ties his neck in just a little bit low. He's really shallow bodied, okay, and flat. And so this guy to me is the one that appears frail in terms of the amount of bone that he has. He's flat ribbed, and consequently, I'll promise you, he's going to be the light muscle one. So let's look at him in terms of base width. Okay, watch him number 1. Okay, you see how that hog, once he goes, he kind of gets outside of his skeleton. And what I mean by that is his hog, from his hock to the ground, he's not very good structurally. But more importantly, I want you to look right here in the seam of his ham. This guy's fat, folks. And so when we study this guy going away, you can see the amount of fat that he has in the seam of his ham, and he's not quite right out of his hip and hind leg. Now focus on number 2 going away. See how he's still wide tracking, very massive at the top side of his hip, okay? Focus on 3, not near as wide tracking as the 2 Barra, but at the same time, he's still adequate in terms of muscle shape. Look at old Calico. Look how narrow that guy tracks. So easily, we can say from behind, well, let's look at him coming at us real quick. Watch the 1 Barra. See how he wants to come in at his knee, coming at you, but he's still got some width. Okay. Focus on 2 coming at you. Really wide chested. We like that. Focus on 3 coming at you. Wants to get a little narrow, but still acceptable. How about this one? Look how narrow. He almost crosses over his front feet. So in terms of top side shape, okay, you can easily see that the 2 Barra and the 3 Barra are the lean, muscular pigs in class. We can see that this hog is really thick, and part of that's due to the fact that he's fat. Okay, so this hog, and we'll talk about where we can look at fat shortly, but he's fat through the seam of his ham, and that's a little bit deceiving because some of that thickness is not expressive muscle, it's fat. And so we can determine that these 2 pigs here are the lean muscular ones, this one's the fat one, and this one's the light muscle one, okay? Real quick, we can look at fat visually on hogs in several places, through their jowl or their jaw. Look how fat this guy is. Through their elbow pocket. When he walks, look at that fat right there in his elbow pocket. We can also see the fat in his flank. And as I said, from behind, he's got a lot of fat in the seam of his ham. Okay, so we're going to move on quickly now. Going back to the fundamentals. First on our list in market hogs, muscle, functionality, structure, and balance. So from this video, and I'm going to play it while we're discussing it, we can determine that the number 2 Barra is the combination of muscularity, body, functionality. He's sound at the ground and backs that up with tremendous base width. And so I like that hog to win. I think it's just as easy to put the number 3 hog second, because he's real high cutability. Remember, cutability is lean and muscular. Although not as wide-based as the black hog, he's still got some base width, and he's still definitely lean. Now, I think it's close on the bottom, and the reason I say that is because this hog's fat and this hog is the lightest muscled. So our question is going to have to be if we're going to be able to live with the amount of fat that one has. He's so much more massive. He's got so much more true muscle shape than the calico. And so I'll give up a little bit of fat and place him over 4, but I think it's close because 4 is leaner, so he's higher cutability, but at the same time, that's the structurally incorrect, narrow, and light muscle barrel. So if we had to put a placing on it, I would place it 2, 3, 1, 4. Okay. I'm going to talk about sheep real quick. Can y'all see the sheep, or do I need to?
We can see them.
Oh, good. Okay. Now on time, moderators, is it okay for me to go over a little bit, or do we need to speed this up considerably? Okay.
Yeah, no, I was trying to message you. You can go over. We don't have a session again until 1 o'clock. So if anyone needs to leave, go ahead. But for those of you who can stick around with us, we can let the meeting continue a little longer.
Oh, that's great because yeah, good. Okay, let's talk about sheep. Sheep and goats are very similar in terms of market animals. These are market lambs. Again, young people, market means muscle, so we're gonna look for indicators of muscle down their tops and from behind, just like cattle and just like hogs. The terminology is a little different in sheep and goats. And so this right here, the muscle mass that he has right here from basically the point, or excuse me, the top of his shoulder to about his 12th rib is called a rack. And so when I say rack, you'll know what I'm talking about. And from his rack to his hip is called a loin, and then from hooks to pins is sometimes referred to as a dock. So if you hear me say those things, you'll know what I'm talking about. So let's look at our class real quick. First off, we got to look at muscle. Second off, in sheep and goats, they're very similar to cattle. I call them mini cattle. Finish is important. We want enough on them to have a quality grade or a quality advantage, but we still want them lean enough to be high cutability. Secondly, we want them structurally correct. We want long extended necks. We want level tops. We want level hips. We want some levelness through the lower 1/3 of their skeleton. And we want sheep and goats to travel with some flex and comfort. Okay. And then again, kind of at the tail end of it, but it all goes back to the big picture, is a balance and eye appeal. So that's my first impression. So if we look at these 4 big differences in these sheep. And so this number 1 lamb, if you'll just follow my cursor from the top of his shoulder out through his tail, that is a very level, high quality sheep. Okay. And if you look at him from his forearm or his foreflank to his rear flank, he's deep, but he's level. Okay. So I like this guy from a first impression. I think he's extended out through his neck. I think he's elevated out through his chest. I think he's good, again, in terms of balance through his center body. And so I like the first impression that he offers. Now, structurally, we need to change this guy just a little bit. So he's still very attractive and eye appealing, but at the same time, remember, we want animals to have some flex and comfort. So if we study this guy from his knee to the ground, he gets a little straight there, okay? But more importantly, as we study him from hock, remember this is a hock, to ground, he gets a little straight. And so I'd like to see more flex right here. It's very hard to see because of his boots, but there's a bone, remember, on the hog right there called a pastern. And this guy gets pretty straight on his pastern, and so it causes him to get up on his toe. And so when we show this video in motion here in a minute, you can see that he gets a little tight. We'd certainly change that about him. My first impression of the 2 lamb is not very good. And so if you can just look at him from a a balance and a look standpoint, this guy's got a lot of issues. And so muscularity wise, we're not going to be able to tell a whole lot. He looks kind of like he's going to have some expression here. And so we're probably not going to be able to totally discount him yet because he may have some muscle. But in regards to structure and balance, I like him the least. And I say that because he attaches his neck in low. He's more pronounced in his breastplate there. He's got more shoulder in him. If you look at his top line, he wants to get easy down his top. And if you look at him down through the lower 1/3 of his skeleton, he's a sheep that gets pretty deep out through his chest. But more importantly, again, from a feet and leg and structure perspective, this guy has too much set to his hock and hind leg. And what I mean by that, if you'll study this cursor, this is the way that his joint or his angles are. So instead of being kind of in the middle between these two sheep, which I'll talk about in a minute, this one is a little too straight. This one's a little bit too curved. And so we call that too much set there. The 3 lamb, when I turn to him, and my first impression is that he's kind of average. That's not a very good term or a very good explanation, but he's just kind of average. He's okay in terms of the way that his neck is attached. He does have some breast and some coarseness of shoulder. We need to change that about him, elevate him up through his chest and clean him up through his shoulder. But he's level down his top. He's level out of his dock. And this guy actually has decent angles to his joints. So this is acceptable, and you can tell that he's got more flex at the ground than does this sheep here. And then the 4 weather, another one, he's high quality to me. There's issues from this cursor back or from his shoulder back. He's acceptable, even though he wants to get off in his loin just a little bit. I like his joints and the angles to his feet and legs probably the best, okay? And so from that, just the side view, I can see easily, here's the off quality sheep, okay? So I'm thinking bottom pair. This one's just kind of so-so, so I'm thinking second or third maybe. And then I'm thinking really good high quality sheep here. So I'm thinking top pair between 1 and 4, an easy bottom, and kind of a third place sheep here. Let's see if it stays the same once we move the video a little further up here. Okay, let's talk about muscle real quick from behind. Again, remember these videos were taken at a little different angles, and so they took shots of 1 and 4 up close, and so obviously you can see that they do have muscularity through the center and lower 1/3 of number 1's leg. Really massive through the center part of his stifle. Definitely has some shape down low, and so I like the muscle shape that he offers. There's a pin bone, there's a pin bone. So remember, the wider the pins, the more muscle shape up through his upper hip. That's a muscular sheep. Now this 2 weather appears to have muscle, and the video's taken a little awkward, but in reality, there's a pin bone and there's a pin bone. So he doesn't have as much upper hip as 1 or 4, but he does have shape through the lower 1/3 of his leg, okay? This guy, there's a pin bone, there's a pin bone. So the center part of his leg, I'm going to call him adequate there. Here's where he's got some problems. I definitely want to see him wider pin, and so consequently he needs to be bigger out of his hip. This guy, lots of muscle. There's a pin bone, there's a pin bone. Very expressive through his center leg and has some lower leg as well. So I like that sheep pretty well there. Let's see, they're going to show us a top shape. Okay, so if you'll look at these videos, again, taking into account that they were taking a little different shots. Again, there's our invisible line going down the middle of his spine. And I measure over his rack and his loin. That sheep's very expressive over his rack He's expressive over his loin. How about this guy? Not much muscle. And so there's our line. And it's hard to see, but that's where that thing falls off right there. So that's pretty light muscled over his rack. And he wants to fade. That's what I call fading over his loin edge there. This guy here, average. And the reason he's average, another reason he's average is he's the short-bodied sheep in class. And so from his last rib back, which is called a hind saddle, he definitely needs to be longer. But not much shape, but he's got some volume of muscle, okay? This guy, again, much like one, you study that line, really expressive over his rack. He's not as good out of his over his loin edge as this sheep, but yet at the same time, he still has some muscle. Okay, let me. Okay, so this is a good view. They went through these sheep one at a time. If you'll look at this two sheep, and they even made a side note down here, this is what he stood like during the contest. The reason he stands like that is because of his skeletal quality. If you'll notice that sheep wants to be really narrow chested, and that's due to the fact that he's so flat in his forerib there. And so that's causing him to really, really break and get up on his spine and off on his hip. And so that's a structural issue for that sheep that we don't like. Okay. All right, so let's finish this sheep deal up real quick. If you study the initial impression and then go back to the fundamentals and our priorities are muscle, finish, structure, and balance. Which sheep combines muscularity, a good look, and some correctness of structure? It's this sheep right here, this number one sheep. Even though he's a little straighter up and more upright on his toe, that sheep is still good enough in terms of a skeleton, and no doubt he's the most expressive in terms of muscularity. He presents a nice balanced look, and he's okay structurally, so that sheep needs to win. Which is the one that's most, or let me back up, the easiest one to place is the two sheep last. He's the issue, the structure issue sheep. He's also the light muscled lamb down his top, but this guy's what I'd call U-necked. He's coarse shouldered. He's off balanced. He's got too much set to his hock. So we put one first, we put two last, and then we have a middle pair here. But which sheep is the most like our class winner? He's lean, he's muscular, and he's still acceptable in terms of structure. That would be the four-weather. Okay, he's definitely longer bodied than the blue sheep. He's got more total muscle, and so he needs to be second. This blue sheep, again, I used the term average with him. He's average, and so he kind of sits in that third place hole pretty easily. He's definitely not the worst, but at the same time, he's not good enough anywhere to justify moving him up. And so he's the short-bodied sheep, but he does have more muscle than two. And so to sum up these market lambs real quick, if you're placing them, the correct placing would have been 1, 4, 3, 2. Okay. All right. Let's move along real quick to goats. And hopefully you can still see my screen. Can you still see my screen?
Yep. Yes, we can.
Okay. All right, real quickly. Market goats are the exact same thing as market lambs. Goats are a little odd creatures out of their hip than any other thing. And so what I mean by that is goats are designed by the good Lord to be a little more round out of their hip. And so even on the good goats, I'm not going to tell you which ones are good yet, but even on the good ones, they're going to be a little rounder hip. They're going to be lower in their tail sets than other species. So we got to kind of let that be part of the game here. So again, just like market cattle, just like market hogs, just like market lambs, market goats are placed on muscle, finish, structure, and balance. So very quickly, we're going to move through these quick. If you'll look at these goats, my first impression, my overall first thought about the one goat is off quality. And the reason I say that, he appears to be short-bodied. He appears to be, even though I just got through saying they're all going to be off in their hip, is that not really, really steep-hipped right there? Okay, so that's not good. If you look at the angles and flex to his joints, which refers back to structure, he's got way more than what I'd consider ideal. Much like that 2 sheep in our market lamb class, this guy has too much set to his hog, okay? That coupled with the fact that he ties his neck in low and he's really playing out through his chest here. Okay, this 2 goat, much better in terms of first impression. At the same time, this guy strikes me as another rather small goat. He's short-bodied, but he does have some balance. He does have some look. He's okay in terms of the angles to his joints. We don't know much about muscularity yet, but it looks like he's going to have some muscle. The 3 goat down here, you know, he strikes me as high quality, but at the same time, there's some trade-offs with him. He's got a little more set to his hog than what I consider ideal. He's not perfect out of his tail set, but more importantly, I get a little more concerned about how he's built up front. He wants to get up in his shoulder just a little bit. We call that a chine bone. It causes that forerib to be a little flatter. Now this 4 goat, they took this video again a little differently. He appears to be a little shorter, but in reality, just knowing the class, he's not. But that's a high quality one. I like the way that it's extended up front. I like the way that his neck attaches high. He's good and level down his top. Now out of his hip, he's not perfect, but he's not necessarily steep. He's just a little short out of his hip. He's okay at the ground in terms of angles, and hopefully you can see right there that he's going to have a lot of muscle, big leg in him. And from a goat perspective, if you can ever get around and judge from in front of them, forearm shape is very, very important. And so the more forearm shape they have, the more muscle they're going to have. So let's get a little more into this video. Okay, so as we study these goats from behind, it becomes very obvious now that we have a light muscle goat to be not only last because of muscle, but he's remember the off balance, low quality goat that had some structure issues and some balance and look issues, and that's this guy here. So you study him down his top, there's our imaginary line. Study the width on either side, and study this guy through the center part of his leg, through the lower part of his leg. He is very flat and light muscled. If you study this guy at the ground, he wants to bow his hawk, and what I mean by that is he wants to get out of his hawk just a little and come in at the ground, and that's not a good thing. So all that means is when this guy walks, he's going to be really narrow at the ground. Remember on those hogs, we study them at the ground, those narrow, light muscle ones walk narrow. Same thing here. This 2 weather has a little bit more muscle through this, especially through the center and lower part of his leg. This 3 weather, he kind of wants to stand a little bit narrower, but he's expressive. And what I mean by that is he's very lean, and so he's going to have some shake down his top. And from behind, he's very similar to 2. Now, hopefully from the computer, you can easily see that the 4 weather is by far the most muscular. He's got the most shake down his top. He's definitely the most massive in terms of his center and lower leg. And so again, from a muscle perspective, a balance and a structure perspective, the easy thing to do now is to find this guy up to win and find number one to lose. And then we got to make a decision in the middle. So let's get to that. Okay, so this is a little better picture than what we saw at first. And so easily, again, as we finish up the market goat deal, this guy here has the most shape. He's got adequate structure. He's got the most four-rib shape in him, and he's got enough look and balance and quality to be an easy place to start. On the other end of the spectrum, it's easy to find the short-necked, the short-bodied, the steep-hipped, the light muscle goat that has too much set to his hock to be an easy last. And then we got to make a decision. So between these two goats, real quick, this guy's more elevated in his chest. He attaches his neck in higher at the top of his shoulder. He's longer necked. He's longer bodied throughout, specifically through his hind saddle. He's leaner. He's higher cutability. This guy's got more rib shape. This guy's probably a little bigger in his forearm. He's probably a little wider based. So there's trade-offs there. So the decision's rather close and the cuts would be pretty small. But if we couple the fact that we keep priorities in mind, muscle and finish, we're going to place 3/2 in a close decision. So to finish up the market goats, if you're placing them, I would have placed it 4, 3, 2, 1. Excellent. All right, I'm going to move. Do we still have time? Moderators, tell me if I need to quit.
If you can do this one really quickly, then we can still go on.
Okay. So I'm going to touch, this is probably the last class that we're going to be able to do, and I want to talk about breeding animals very quickly in a generic sense before we get to this cattle deal, and that way we can at least cover the basics real quick. Can y'all see that?
Yes, we can.
All right, on breeding animals, and they're all going to be the same, on cattle, on hogs, on sheep and goats. Structural correctness becomes a very, very important criteria on any breeding class. And so, and it correlates to the fact that we're putting animals, both males and females, back into production. And so we want genetics to be predictable. And so we want structurally correct animals. All that means is how skeletons are put together, how those puzzle pieces of bone work and framework fit together. And so that's very, very important. That's number one. In breeding cattle specifically, we want big-bodied females. And obviously that correlates to the fact of pregnancy. Once they get bred, we want them to be able to maintain pregnancy, to have a calf. And so that's the home for the baby for 9 months. And so we want a big rib cage in them. We like them to be nice, balanced. That all goes back to the big picture and my first impression. We want them to be level and good looking. Femininity refers to, well, basically what they look like, how pretty they are, and also some female traits in terms of udders and vulvas and those things. Performance comes into it, and all performance means is growth potential, how big they're going to be at maturity, and those types of things. You'll notice that muscle way down the list. But if you'll go back up here to structural correctness, if they're built right from a bone perspective, if they've got volume and body, they're definitely going to have muscularity as well. Hogs, again, structural correctness is first. Volume, balance, femininity, and then muscle shape comes down here. And so keep in mind that we've got to put those bones together correctly. On sheep and goats, structural correctness should be kind of based or put above growth and performance. Again, we want them to be long neck, level topped, and correct at the ground. Volume and functionality, balance, followed by muscle. Okay, so just think of sheep and goats, and especially hogs. Hogs give birth to litters, right? And so multiple births. Most sheep and goats will have twins, sometimes triplets. And so volume and body capacity are very important, obviously, in those species. So going quickly. Let's talk about this class of breeding heifers very quickly. So as you look at these 4 cattle real quick, the first thing that you want to see is, are they good enough skeletally? Are they good enough in terms of body and volume? Are they good enough in terms of presence and look and femininity? And that all correlates to the fact, do they have enough balance and look? So this class was from Louisville, Kentucky a couple years ago, really, really high quality class. And so all 4 of these females are good. They're show cattle, and so obviously you're not going to see that kind of quality just driving around out in a commercial setting. But let's just study them very quickly, one at a time. This heifer, number 1, from her shoulder blade back, is about as good of a heifer as you can make. Love this one down her top line. She's extremely long and level out of her hip. She's unbelievably proportional through the center part of her body. And remember, on angles of joints and comfort at the ground, really flexible, really correct from hock to ground. But more importantly, as you study her up through her front knee, from her knee to the ground, extremely good there. Now, what do we not like about her? That's not the most feminine heifer that I've ever seen, and she's not the most extended out through her neck. Those are all things, I call them just more cosmetic type of things that I can oversee in the big picture, because again, from this one back is about as good a beast as you can make in terms of show cattle or heifers in general. This 2 heifer, she should kind of strike you as one that's kind of average, if you will. And to explain that a little further, she's not the most feminine heifer in class, but at the same time, she's adequate there. She needs to be extended out through her neck. She's good enough in terms of levelness down her top from her blade to her hip. Right here from her hooks to her pins is where we take issue with her, and she wants to get off and steepen her hip a little bit. She's got a little more set to her hock and hind leg than this heifer, but she's still acceptable. I like her volume. I like her balance, or excuse me, her body and her rib. Look at this 3 heifer. She's the off quality heifer. And so if you look at her starting from her nose back, she's the one that's the least feminine. I call her almost bullheaded. She's almost masculine about her head and her neck. She gets cresty about her neck. She's short necked. She's not very attractive. She's got some issues right here in terms of her top line. There's her hook bone. There's her pin bone. She wants to be steep and off in her hip. Most importantly, let's study her angles at the ground from a bone perspective. She's too straight. And you can see that right there. She's straight from hock to ground. She's too short and straight in her pastern. So when we put her in motion, we're going to have issues. And I can tell you that as straight as she is, she's narrow chested and she's narrow from behind. That causes her to be, even though she's white, it's hard to see, pinched and flat in her rib cage. Now this heifer here, I saw this class in person and I could tell you she was pretty big, and so that concerned me a little bit. But from a video, I like her. I think she's the most feminine in class. She's the one that's got the longest, most extended neck, got a pretty head on her. She's good enough down her top. She's good enough in terms of flexibility. Here is her issue. Right here is the fact that she wants to get a little straight from knee to ground, and so she's a little pinched in her forerib. I'm going to start this video and talk about them as we go, and then we'll be finished with our talk. Okay, from behind, again, that's not the most important angle, obviously, in females, but you can see the amount of volume that this heifer has here. Don't ever confuse gut feel with volume. And so volume is true rib shape. And if they've got true rib shape, they're going to have some belly to go with it. And so all of these cattle, again, I said that was a high quality class. All of those cattle are good enough in terms of muscularity. Real quick, I want y'all to watch these cattle move real quick. See how flexible and comfortable this one heifer is at the ground. Just really, really good in the way that she covers her track on the go. The two heifer, again, another one we said had a little more set to her hock, but she's still comfortable. Look at this heifer here. She's the narrow one. Play that one more time. She's the narrow one that's got more issues out of her hip. And this heifer here, and again, another one that covers her track relatively neat and clean. So let me finish here. All right, so again, in breeding animals, because we're not going to be able to do the sheep or the goats or the hogs, breeding animals, structural correctness is paramount. Volume, body, balance, look, femininity, all those things come into play with muscle coming in kind of at the end of the list. So from this view here, or from this set of cattle, it's pretty easy to find this number one heifer to win. She was one that was very competitive on the show circuit and won a lot of national shows, but that's irrelevant how she did there. I just like this one in terms of overall body and functionality. The next easy thing to do, in my opinion, is find this feminine one here that's acceptable in terms of her skeleton to be second. Although we'd modify her here from knee to ground, give her more forerib shape, I think she's got enough body overall. I think she's high quality and feminine. And then we got to make a decision between these two lower quality ones. Again, from a female perspective, in terms of structure, we like this heifer better. She's stouter. She's bigger in her rib. She's also got more flex and comfort, more muscularity, and still backs that up with more femininity up front. This heifer here is not feminine enough to win, or excuse me, to get off the bottom. She's too flat in her forerib. She's got too many issues at the ground structurally. So that's a very quick synopsis of a breeding cattle evaluation. So if you're replacing it, it would have been 1-4, 2-3, with a rather close placing on bottom. Anyway, I know that was short and very quick. I hope you enjoyed the session and hopefully learned something about livestock evaluation. Moderators, not sure what I need to do at this point, but I will wrap it up at this point. So tell me what to do next.
You're good. Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for joining us and participating. If there's a quick question, we can do that for a minute or two. But if no one has a question, then I'll go ahead and end the meeting. So does anyone have a question really quick? Okay, well, if there's no questions, thank you so much again. And everyone, don't forget to go fill out that quick survey to be entered to win some door prizes. And if you are joining us this afternoon, you will have to go click on the link again to rejoin the meeting for this afternoon. So thanks again, everyone.